Welcome and thank you for joining our second monthly Geothink and Learn on the future of open data. I'd like to give a special thank you to those of us sharing their lunch hour with us. So we appreciate you joining us on your breaks. My name is Sonia. I'm the project manager here at Geothink, and I will be moderating today's panel. So I'll begin by just briefly introducing our Geothink panelists today. They will each present on the future of open data, starting with our panel chair, Professor Peter Johnson, Associate Professor of Geography and Environmental Management at Waterloo. Pamela Robinson, Associate Professor and Assistant Dean at Ryerson School of Urban and Regional Planning. Jean-Noé Landry, Executive Director of Geothink Partner Organization, Open North, Canada's leading open data nonprofit. Teresa Scaza, Professor and Canada Research Chair in Information Law at the University of Ottawa. And last but certainly not least, Marcy Boucherfield, Executive Director of Neptis Foundation, a charitable foundation conducting nonpartisan research of Canada's urban regions, and another Geothink partner organization. So the panel will be followed today by a Q&A session that's open to all our participants. And before I pass it over to Professor Johnson, I'd just like to remind the viewers of the 3 central ways that they can participate in today's webinar. So first, by clicking the Raise Your Hand feature on the top left of your screen, this notifies us that you'd like to share both your audio and video settings to ask a question. So before you do, you will just need to accept a pop-up that will show up on your screen by clicking the microphone icon. And just a reminder that the camera will then record your video and audio settings. The second way is to use the Q&A function, which is also on the top left of your screen. So this will send a written question to our group of panelists without recording the video. And finally, the same Q&A button is available with an anonymous feature, so you can post a written question to our panelists anonymously. There's also a general chat function at the bottom of your screen that you can use at any time. If you're experiencing audio or video delays, you can let us know. Unfortunately, these options are not available to those of you joining us via telephone. And a final reminder that the entire session today will be recorded and disseminated on our website at geothink.ca and elsewhere. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to our chair, Professor Peter Johnson.
Great. All right. Thanks, Sonia. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right. There we go. All right. So just a few words about Geothink. So geothink.ca. You can check us out online and at Twitter. So this is Geoweb and City Citizen Interactions. This is a partnership grant that's funded by the Canadian federal government research agency to look at these different interactions, and we're in our 5th year right now, and we have 13 different co-applicants at universities all across Canada. We've funded many students doing lots of really exciting research, so check out what we've got. Like Sonia said, today we're going to be talking about the future of open data. And here's our little blurb about that. When I think about the future of open data, it's a good moment right now, I think, to reflect on what we've done through Geothink and other initiatives that have been going on to see sort of where we were and where we are right now. And that's pretty much where I'm going to start with my presentation here. I'm trying to wrap this up in a few minutes. So when I think about open data and the work that we've done through Geothink, I really think back to some of the early days when we were starting to put this grant together and talking with representatives from municipal governments all across Canada, but mostly in my own region here in the Kitchener-Waterloo area, about an hour and a half outside of Toronto. So the image I have here on my first screen is the region of Waterloo, which is an upper tier municipal government. Their open data catalog, and they were one of the first organizations in our region to deliver open data. So, and that was about 2009. And they had, just like that, a list of files, different formats that you could download. So it's a bit of a trip to kind of go back and think about those really early days where it was a major achievement just getting that data online. Now, within the region of Waterloo, there's 3 cities: the city of Waterloo, where I'm located, the city of Kitchener, which is a little bit larger, and then the city of Cambridge. And each of these different municipal governments has adopted open data on a bit of a different timeline. And I really like this because it sort of shows, the early adopter versus the late adopter, and then sort of the laggard type of adoption. So I also caused to reflect on some of those challenges from the early days. So thinking about the future of open data, really we have to reflect on where we've been here. And some of those challenges, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, you know, the content challenges, the what to put on your open data portal, the technical challenges, for sure, how to actually do it, and the organizational ones as well. So the why, like why are we delivering open data? What's driving our organization to do this? The resourcing, who's going to pay for it, where are the funds going to come from, and then finally the jurisdictional issues, so sort of the where are we providing open data. So I look at these different cities within the region of Waterloo, and I really think that they provide this really cool case study. So for example, talk a little bit about the city of Kitchener as a really good example, and that they were a laggard in open data provision. They didn't really start providing open data until 2014, which in a Canadian sense is sort of after that kind of like peak first wave of municipal governments providing open data. And they launched with a very limited catalog. It was really like a list of about a dozen different files, mostly GIS files, things that they already had available that they already provided in other areas, but not centrally through an open data portal. Compared to the city of Waterloo, the region of Waterloo, and the city of Cambridge, however, the city of Kitchener did something that was really quite a bit different, in that they developed an open government policy as well at the same time that they were doing this. So it took them a little bit longer to get started, but I think they went about it in a way that was quite good. So I've got a little bit about their open government framework there, and the key part that open data fills with that through the transparency aspect of it as well. So Kitchener also did a couple of other things really well here. I think maybe they learned from the experience of other municipal governments across Ontario and across Canada. They actually developed a digital Kitchener strategy as well, a little bit after the open government strategy. But this allowed them to overcome some of the issues that have plagued other open data projects, right? The launch of different open data portals. They kind of framed it a little bit more as an open data program and embedded it within this open government strategy and this digital strategy as well. So they really crossed the organization as well. And because they had this top level policy, they were able to do really, really cool things. They have a director of IT and then specific digital Kitchener staff, which is really neat at the municipal level to be able to actually have these paid employees and paid staff. This is Dan Murray, who's the director of the City of Kitchener IT, who would really drive that agenda for digital and open data as well. And this allowed them to make more natural connections with things like the planning department, GIS, public works, and communications as well. And one thing that they did here as well is because they were launching their open data portal a little bit later, they worked on existing inter-organizational cooperation points. So all the GIS managers for the different cities within the region of Waterloo, they all got together and they all decided that rather than each offering their own sort of siloed data, that they would join together and they would adopt the same portal software, the same open data portal software, and that would allow them to share their catalogs a little bit more easily. So right now, if you go to the Open Data Kitchener website, you can actually find data there from the city of Waterloo, the city of Cambridge, the region of Waterloo as well. So this is really, really neat in that they've created this type of federated open data portal. So when I think about the sort of like the future of open data, I reflect on these last 5 years, and I think about this transition from these standalone open data portals towards more robust open data programs, right? So this is a big change here. This change from just delivering the data, putting it online as like a list of files, and instead having things like an open government policy that will allow them to kind of reach across their organizations, develop best practices as well. So I've listed there ODC, that's the Open Data Charter, which some of you might be familiar with as these types of international best practices that municipalities can adopt. This also allows them to do things like formalizing jobs and responsibilities, make open data more than just something that would be on the side of someone's desk, right? Have it be an actual key part of the organization. Allow them to hire dedicated staff with specific expertise, and then also take advantage of new technologies to have these multi-purpose platforms that allow not just for data to be delivered, but allow for citizens or individuals to download data in different formats, to do basic types of analysis in the browser, that type of thing. So when I think about the future of open data, I think of a continued sort of shift here, right? Moving from just simply delivering open data to embedding it more completely in open government policies. So this portal to program sort of idea when I think about the future of open data. So that's what I have right there. I think that right next, we're going to be going to Pamela, correct?
Yep, that's me. I'm next. Thanks, Peter. To everyone on the call, hi, I'm a professor of urban planning in Toronto, downtown Toronto at Ryerson University, and I'm also a registered professional urban planner. So my real interest in the future of open data relates to how local governments are going to use it and what they're going to do. And one of the things that Peter didn't talk about in this transition from the early days to the middle days of open data is Peter and Renee wrote this really great paper called Civic Open Data at the Crossroads, in which they provide 4 different ways in which open data is used. You publish it, you exchange the code, you track issues with it, and then it gets embedded in a participatory open data environment. And so I think that framework is really helpful for all of us and interested in understanding what the future looks like, because the next question is, what's the 5th phase and what's the 6th phase? We certainly saw a big focus in the early days simply around getting the portals up and getting them populated with data. And some of the first critical thinking questions I think that were interesting related to what kinds of data do people want, and how does government, who sits on this massive pile of data, figure out how to go back into the archives and bring things. So we saw interactions between government and citizen groups and entrepreneurs around voting up data, for example. Province of Ontario did it. But also questions from really nuanced local government staff, like at the City of Toronto, around wondering if, in addition to voting up, there needed to be other ways of letting people have access to data, because it's not always going to be the most popular data set that's the most useful. When the province of Ontario opened up its open data portal to begin with, one of the interesting things that they found was that the most popular thing people wanted was pet names. That's fun, but not necessarily transformative in terms of transparency, openness, and inclusion. So I think we started to see different forms of local government staff interacting with the open data community. And so we saw, for example, in Toronto, a longstanding open data book club night where once a month people get together to talk about data sets. And then we saw the rise of civic tech hack nights, which started in the States and now are common across Ottawa and in Toronto and other cities across the country, where people get together on a week-by-week basis to talk about something related to digital governance or open data, and then try to figure out what to do with it. And that typically takes place when people work together on the creation of apps and new app outputs. So those kinds of things are interesting. And Peter and I did research 2 years ago where we interviewed Geothink partners about their engagement in civic tech hack nights and in hackathons to try to understand what role these played in helping them do their work. And I think the most interesting finding, for me at least as a planner, was that the space of the hackathon created a new working environment for staff to work with members of the public. They weren't obligated in a particular way to take a decision that was political, and it wasn't just a dog and pony show to show information, but it was a collaborative space to start to kick ideas around. And so it's one of the legacies, I think, of this middle stage of open data. One of the challenges I think we see right now that began in the early days and continues to persist with open data is that there's this it's a tension between the civic use of the data and the entrepreneurial use of the data. And entrepreneurs have been active since day one in terms of making use of data from open data sets. But the challenge, I think, that continues is, how do we unlock the civic or the public good in the data sets? And what does that good look like? And how do we create the capacity in civil society groups to work with open data? I've recently published a paper with my research colleague, Lisa Ward-Mather, that's coming out in a journal that a bunch of us contributed to, that introduces this notion of libraries as civic intermediaries, people who hold the public good space for members of the public to work with open data. And I think over and over, as open data continues to be released, we're going to have to seed opportunities for the public to work with the data. The public may have good ideas, but may not know how to work with the data in the form that it exists. And so trying to create digital and data literacy in civil society groups is a really important thing for people to take on. One experiment that we've tried here at Ryerson, our School of Continuing Education partnered with Code for Canada and Civic Tech Toronto, and we built a course called CVUP 110, which is digital governance. And we're in its 4th offering. We've offered 2 face-to-face sessions of it, and then 2 purpose-built sessions for Ministry of Transportation. And it's a 7-week course, 21 hours of learning, where Code for Canada and Civic Tech Toronto staff, and me a little bit, explain and teach about digital governance. And the audience has been mostly people working provincially and municipally. And it's been really interesting to see the kinds of conversations that come out of that. I think one of the most exciting things about the learners that we've worked with so far is that they're highly motivated government staff who want to find ways to use the techniques of open data and open government in the work that they're doing. And then now, I'm in Toronto, so it's hard not to be bumping up against this. We now find this new point of interaction, I think, in the future of open data between open data and smart cities. As I think lots of people may know, Sidewalk Labs, which is Google's urban planning development unit, announced 4 weeks ago that they're going to invest 50 million American dollars, so about 65 million Canadian dollars over the next year, to plan a new smart community. And one of the interesting questions that our Geothink team has been asking since the minute that launch came out is, where's the piece that's related to open, and how will that work? Clearly there is proprietary interest in the kinds of big data that their smart city networks are going to collect. They've got really good discussion about privacy on their website. Embedded in their 196-page vision document is a discussion about the technology platform and about the principles of open, but they haven't come right out and articulated yet in these early days what their open data strategy is going to look like. And I think one of the questions that we should all be turning our minds to is, what's the role of open data in a smart city? And I think we need to start advocating that smart cities need to be open cities too. I think we need to strike a balance between their proprietary interest and the public good and the interest in the kinds of data that are released, I think. I also think that we need to keep a careful eye on the nature of the data that comes out of smart city catalogs, because if they're just releasing data that's fun but not very useful, it's not going to be very helpful in terms of accomplishing the open government goals that smart cities are supposed to advocate for, which include transparency, openness, and inclusion. So I think the future of open data is more tightly coupled to open government and smart city movements than just portals alone. So we're going to see open data as an input and both an output of these two waves of change that are coming over Canadian cities. Thank you.
And we'll take it over to Jean-Noé.
Great. So thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today. I'm going to build on a couple of themes that that Pamela mentioned. Who can avoid talking about what's going on in Toronto these days? So it's going to be tough for me not to address those types of issues as well. But I want to take a little bit of a step back in terms of the types of things that we're seeing at Open North. So part of the work that we do at Open North really enables us to connect the global conversation and the global open data and open government movement and bring that back to Canada through a range of different projects that we're doing here across the country. Some of the observations that I want to share with you today are based on analysis that's building into a publication that we're going to be releasing next year at the next International Open Data Conference in Argentina, which follows the event that took place in Madrid last year in the fall. And that publication will be the state of open data for the world. So there's 35 different chapters. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some trends that we've been seeing. Obviously, we're not going to be the only ones writing that big publication. We're reaching out to 30 to 40 different authors that are going to be contributing to that. So first theme, I think cities is obviously, in many ways we could argue that cities is where a lot of the kind of initial momentum came from. On the open data front, mainly because the data sets and the types of issues that city managers were dealing with were closest to the needs and the services that were connecting with citizens themselves. But, I'd be remiss to say that the open data community started only, 5 or 8 years ago. I think we're really looking at, a much kind of longer term. It may not have been called open data, but if we look at some of the early scientific consortiums in Canada, especially around the Arctic, I think that's where you see some of the original roots of the open data community. But on cities, I think some of the challenges and the things that we're seeing now, and we are definitely moving past the if you build it, they will come model of having an open data portal and expecting that people will kind of magically kind of show up, and if anything, if it's the people that are in positions of privilege or certain access to power or understanding of how to be able to access data that will go and seek out that data and use their their skills to be able to request more data. So we are facing a scaling challenge in Canada. There are multiple different open data portals across the country, but there's a coordination challenge in terms of harmonizing our open data policies from an interjurisdictional perspective, which is key. Canada has yet to adopt the International Open Data Charter, so we look to Canada for that leadership. But more to the point about cities, I mean, I think at Open North, we like to connect and speak about cities from an open, resilient, and smart cities perspective. And Pamela and I and a few other researchers had the opportunity to collaborate on a discussion paper on the value added of open data for resilience, urban resilience. And what we discovered by interviewing a number of different researchers is that the open data community is obviously very tech savvy and obviously very data savvy, and it knows a lot about a range of different issues. But if you look at it from a field building exercise, there's a number of different communities of practice that don't necessarily know how or where to find the open data community, if there is such a thing as a single community for the open data movement. So I think we're facing kind of a field building kind of challenge, but also kind of being able to kind of recognize that open data is not a homogeneous community, and it's quite diverse and eclectic, and it starts to make a lot of sense when we look at the value added of open data as it weaves itself into different types of problem framing and co-creation. So that's the one piece on cities. I think more broadly, looking forward, I mean, I think the issue of inclusion is a major one that confronts the open data community. We still have a long way to go on gender equity, for example, in the open data community. Limited research data related to gender issues is still the norm, and a lack of parity within the open data community itself. I think if we look at open heroines, for example, or Mujeres OGP, to support women who work on open data, there's a number of things that are happening around the world that we should take notice here in Canada. And then on inclusion, I think we're at the point now where we're asking really tough questions from a data ethics perspective. And the term that I like to use is data poverty. So we talk about food deserts, but we also have data deserts. And so we need to critically assess, the biases that are introduced in data collection methods, and be able to understand who is marginalized, systemically by the way that we're collecting data, and what data do we have that exacerbates socioeconomic disparities in our community and in our society. So the notion of data poverty is one that kind of compels us or encourages us to think not only critically about data collection methods, but also look at who is not part of the open data conversation that should be, and how do we kind of redouble our efforts to kind of really reach kind of values of inclusion from a movement building perspective. A couple of other points. There's, obviously internationally, we're seeing a backsliding of a number of different countries that had been associated with kind of leadership in the open data space. Obviously, the US is a case in point, but I think it's very important to look at these types of cases and context to be able to learn how they're maneuvering these challenging kind of political times from a transparency and accountability and open data perspective, and really kind of take stock of what's going on there, and not assume or presume that the political kind of openness to engage in open data and open government will be permanent. So we really need to kind of entrench the change that we want, whether it's through an open data law, for example, or really pushing for policies. And the last piece here before turning it over to the next speaker, specifically to the Canadian context, I think we're facing a sustainability challenge for the open data community nationally and also regionally. If you look at the Canadian Open Data Summits and the fact that we still don't have a host for next year's summit, these are challenges when you have a number of different activists that are that are committed, and a scaling exercise that takes place, and more people are engaged in it, but you still don't have kind of permanent resources or a permanent secretariat to be able to ensure continuity, to host and to curate the continued engagement of the open data community across the country. So that's it for now. Lots more to say, but looking forward to the next speakers and to take some questions. Thank you.
Great. All right, next up is Teresa Scassa.
There, got myself unmuted. I'm at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law, and my areas of research interest are law and policy. And in particular, in my research, I've focused a lot on ownership and control of data, as well as on privacy issues. And so those, when I talk about the future of open data, those are the things that are of greatest interest to me. And so when we think about open data, the paradigm is generally one of governments collecting data and then engaging in the process of making a growing number of data sets available to the public for unrestricted reuse. And so some of the contemporary challenges, and different speakers have already spoken about these, include how to get more data sets out there, how to increase the resources and provide stable resources for open data, how to change the culture of government with respect to releasing data sets, how to make data more accessible, how to raise awareness about the available data and to encourage uptake and use of it, data literacy, and so on. What then are some of the challenges when we look to the future of open data? One of the challenges that I see lies within what I see as a shift in the paradigm in which governments are responsible for collecting and maintaining the large data sets about citizens, about government services and activities, about the uptake and use of municipal resources, and so on. Excuse me. Because in the smart cities context, for example, governments are increasingly entering into partnerships with private sector companies for the delivery of services, for the provision of sensors that will collect data, and for the software to process and analyze those data. So an example of this would be, and it's a very basic example, would be, the GPS systems that are installed on public transit vehicles, along with the software for collecting and processing the data about the vehicle location. And there are many more examples. Obviously, you can think of all kinds of different sensors that are being increasingly embedded within the smart cities environment. And so in this context, the government itself may no longer be the actual collector of important data, and also of data that's considered to be municipal data or data about municipal government or government's activities. Also, governments have other options now instead of collecting data themselves. And for example, they may decide to source certain types of data from the private sector. Examples of this would be the use of Strava data on cycling patterns or bicycle use. Strava is an app company. People who use the Strava app provide all sorts of data about their cycling habits and patterns, and Strava packages and sells this data or licenses this data to different municipalities to use for various planning purposes. Another example would be data from Waze for road usage and traffic patterns and so on. So cities, instead of collecting this type of data for their own planning purposes, might then go to these different app companies and get a license to use the data for certain purposes, but they won't own the data. And they may in fact be required under their license, in terms of their licenses, to keep it confidential. So they certainly can't share it as open data. Another possibility, and this is a little bit different from the two previous examples I've given, is where governments decide to adopt certain custom-built platforms that will communicate or provide data to the public through different types of visualizations or analytics. And then, because they're doing this, they might choose either not to make the data available as open data, because from their point of view, they've already made the data publicly accessible, and therefore they've met their obligation. Or they might decide to make the data available as open data, but not on the same terms, on the same timelines, or in the same way as they do when they provide it to the particular platform. And an example that I've looked at in this regard is crime mapping platforms. So that example is a little bit different from the other two, in that the government is still the data source, but it's using non-open data tools for sharing that data, and may in fact be creating two-tier levels of access to to the city data one level over the platform that they've adopted, and then open data as an afterthought or on different terms and conditions. And I'll say a little bit more about two-tier access in a bit. So those, I think, are some of the issues around involving this shift in paradigm, where you see much greater involvement of the private sector in both the collecting and the processing, processing, and sharing of municipal data. The consequences of some of these developments may in fact be less and less government data that can be made available as open data. And in fact, it may even be changing the concept or understanding of what is government data. In other words, a generation from now, or even less, or whatever you call a generation in our rapidly moving digital terms, we may no longer even think of this type of data as government data. I've grown up thinking that public transit data is public sector data, but in fact, in 5 years, it may be private sector data. There are issues in here that are important around how governments contract with the private sector. We really need to pay a lot of attention to thinking about what kind of contracts governments enter into with private sector suppliers to ensure that governments are in fact the owners of the data that they're contracting for, and that they can make it available as open data. Another issue is the changing nature of data. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to be really quick about this. The kind of data collected by governments is changing in nature and in application. This is going to impact open data as well. Open data infrastructures, including portals and licenses and so on, have been designed for static data sets, but more and more data is going to be collected in real time and will have value because it's real-time data. And while some real-time data is already being made available as open data, for example, transit GPS data, it's clear that there are no set principles around what open means in this context. How good should the access be? How complete? How timely? How frequently should people be able to access the data through APIs? What should an open license look like for real-time data? And should registration, for example, be required for APIs where it's not? And I think that in this context, we also see again this possibility of two-tier access to data, in that you have you have the real-time data, and then you have the level of access to that real-time data that's carved out for open data. So you can, so that's, it might be possible to still say this is open data, but the level of access through the API may be significantly constrained. So that's another set of issues that's important to think about in terms of providing the infrastructure for new types of data. The third issue that I had, I'm not going to have time to get into it, is privacy, or get into it in any detail, but this is always something we can talk about in the questions. And so I think I'm just, rather than sort of rush in and sort of throw out some ideas about privacy, I'm just going to stop there and we can talk about privacy in the discussion period. So thank you.
All right, great. Thanks, Teresa. And just to everybody, we've got a whole bunch of questions rolling in here, and Sonia and I are keeping track of them and copying them down. So we'll start those right after Marcy Birchfield from the Neptis Foundation.
Thanks, Peter. There's amazing alignment between what we are all talking about and not having actually connected to talk about what we're going to talk about. So I'm really impressed here. So I'm Marcy Birchfield from the Neptis Foundation. I'm the executive director of the Neptis Foundation. And for those of you who don't know our organization, we're a charitable foundation located in Toronto. And we work on regional land use and transportation planning issues. We look at, sort of growth and change in Canadian cities across Canada, or cities across Canada, I should say, city regions across Canada. But most of our research has really been focused on provincial policies that are in place to govern planning across the Greater Toronto area and Hamilton, and then this ring of municipalities outside of the Greater Toronto area, Hamilton, which makes up the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So we use data all the time, and in both our reports and analysis, and also on a platform that we created and developed and launched in the last couple of years, called the Neptis Geoweb. And most of those data sets are either data sets that we've compiled through municipal planning data sets, or provincial planning data sets, or from various sources, because we really work at a regional scale. So I'm just going to share my screen now. There. I think, is that, oh, I hit the button. And sorry about this. there we go. So really what I want to talk about is the future. What does the future of open data look like when government is challenged to keep pace with technological change? So I say this because, you know, this whole, as Pamela suggested, you know, this whole sidewalk labs in Toronto and smart cities has really come to a head in terms of the planning discussions in Toronto. And so it was already in amongst many conversations about smart cities in general. And I happened to attend one at the University of Toronto that brought a bunch of experts from, you know, everything from economic development to municipal finance to public health, housing and landscape design. And one of the sort of the big themes that came out of that discussion was around the inability of government to really keep pace with technological change that is happening. And I think that's really at the forefront of what the smart cities movement is really all about. It's applying technology to different problems in cities. And unfortunately, you know, there are many cities and many departments within cities that aren't really, I would suggest, sort of up to speed when it comes to, you know, sort of the state-of-the-art technology, and so they're a bit vulnerable to these sales pitches that are happening through smart cities. So with that in the background, I wanted to sort of kind of hearken to some, you know, to some lessons that we can learn from the past. So, you know, with all of this challenge of governments unable to keep up with technological pace, I think what we see is more reliance on sort of public and private partnerships to either produce data, produce software that government can work within, and so on and so forth. But we actually have a history of this in Ontario, and it starts with something with the Ontario Land Registry, actually. So in 1987, you know, the provincial government and the provincial public servants actually, you know, recognize that the land registry system was quite overwhelmed. And at the time, there was sort of a hot housing market. There was difficulty and time lags in terms of getting properties registered. There were two different kinds of registry systems, one for sort of more populated areas and another one that was completely different, you know, for more rural areas. And they were really complex systems. And so government was challenged, you know, and they were paper-based systems at that. So governments recognize the need to digitize these things. And if you can think back, what is that, almost, you know, 30 years from now, in 1987, you know, the digital capabilities of anyone at that time was fairly limited. And this whole idea of digitizing, you know, paper-based records in some kind of digital form could be seen as quite a bit of an obstacle. So in 1991, civil servants in the Provincial Ministry of Consumer and Commercial Relations suggested that the government should enter into a public-private partnership to get this job done, to convert millions of records essentially into a paper-based system. And so they entered into this sort of public-private partnership, which had very lengthy contracts and sort of challenging circumstances in both the roles of government and both of the private sector. But in 2003, as this headline shows, the government sold their stakes in this sort of public-private partnership, and with it, you know, and some would say, and particularly what this article shows, they really sold it for a very much an undervalued price when it comes to what that private sector company can actually make on various value-added applications that were created by its control of this what once was a public system. And I bring this example up, you know, partly because the government decided that, you know, that was one government of the day, and that sort of that decided to enter into this partnership, another government of the day that actually sold it, and then another government of the day that was considering buying it back, essentially, because there was value that was realized that wasn't there. Thank you. And so I think this is a lesson, essentially one big lesson, because this particular data set on Land Registry tells you anything from who is buying property in your province, how much it's going for. You know, there are many different questions that, you know, academics can ask this data set, civil servants can ask this data set, and also, you know, people like organizations like ourselves that kind of hold government account to some of the policies they're making. So I put sort of a list of questions to think about, and I think many of these questions have actually already been raised by some of these, by some of the other speakers. But it's if we're unable to keep pace with, you know, government's able to keep pace with technology change, we are going to be relying on more and more of these public-private partnerships. And what are the implications of the ownership of the data? Let's hope we don't have a whole other, you know, land registry Terranet taking over our public records again. And what is left for our open data catalogs? Is it the most or the least value data sets, essentially? And I think, you know, these have huge implications for government even understanding whether their policies are working or not, along with citizens being able to hold government to account. So this is this is the application that I was talking about that we created for citizens to understand planning in the Toronto region. And this would benefit tremendously from something like the Land Registry that can tell you, you know, parcel by parcel, how we've changed the landscape of Ontario over, you know, since the plans have been put in place. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe keep up the questions.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone, for your wonderful discussion. There's all kinds of really great issues coming up here. And our audience, filled also with lots of experts as well, have tapped into some of these. So we're going to get started with some of the questions. And so I'm just going to pose these to the group. And if you want to tackle it, then either just put up your hand or just start, and we'll figure it out that way. So the first question will go to Dr. Renee Sieber from McGill University. Renee is actually the PI on Geothink, so maybe it's fitting that Renee gets the first question, but she was in there first too, so there you go. So Renee asks, why does the future of open data require we harmonize? I see it as homogenize, open data across jurisdictions. Cities are diverse and we should celebrate that diversity. Isn't harmonization really driven by app developers? And there's Renee. So I've just asked Renee's question there. I think this came up during Jean Nouet's talk, I think maybe in reference to some of Jean Nouet's comments. So maybe we'll start with Jean Nouet if you have something to say with that.
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, for sure, you know, the harmonization benefits app developers, but it also actually benefits users of data. When we talk about interoperability, which is one of the core tenets of the, or principle rather, of the International Open Data Charter, there's obviously a reason why that principle is so important, to be able to not only harmonize, but when we unpack our harmonization, we're also talking about having a common language and a common set of principles to communicate, to collaborate, and to co-create. And so I think for an interjurisdictional framework to emerge, I think that's the conversation that's happening right now between provinces and territories and the federal government. It's not one that we saw in the previous administration in Canada. And we're seeing the benefits as they are being documented of multiple different jurisdictions adopting the Open Data Charter. This goes back to issues of licensing and policies in order to be able to coordinate our efforts more effectively. So, you know, I think harmonization, I did not mean that in terms of homogenizing or, you know, having everybody do the same thing. I think harmonizing can actually create enabling conditions for greater diversity and plurality.
Okay, great, thanks.
Peter, can I just add to that?
Jump in there, yeah, Marcy?
Yeah, so I mean, since we work on a regional scale, we need data that is common across municipal boundaries. And so this whole idea of data standardization and, you know, harmonized, at least prioritizing there are many policies that actually do work across municipal jurisdictional boundaries. And so, you know, at least prioritizing around what are the data sets that are required from it and need to be open for people to understand whether those policies are working on. I think harmonize is not a bad term from that perspective.
Yeah. Pamela?
Yeah, I just want to bring everyone on the webinar's attention to the good work of our colleague at SUNY Buffalo, Monica Stevens, who wrote a really great paper looking at the Socrata platform and made the economic argument that the lack of harmonization and coordination meant that sometimes people were paying 3 times through service fees for the same data because it scaled up. And so I think if we think about, no one's making any new money anymore, and governments increasingly have to rationalize their open data programs. So one way we could make the money we're spending go further is to make sure that those kinds of frictions and redundancies aren't happening, because we can't be wasting money or time on reproducing things like that. We need to put all of our efforts towards coordinating release as much as possible, as cheaply as possible.
Maybe just to add to that, Peter, I mean, one project that we're doing actually right now in Quebec with the cultural industry is to develop multi-stakeholder shared data governance models. So, you know, there are kind of common or joint interests in order to collaborate and to develop, you know, a common, you know, metadata kind of standard around data that, you know, people want to share. And so the common benefits of kind of working together goes hand in hand in a way with harmonization. But of course, you're going to be kind of bumping into kind of privacy issues and what data can you share and what are the, you know, the conditions for that. But I think we're seeing, just like Pamela just said, kind of an incentive to bring people together and to develop new ways and practices around sharing and collaborating. And if that fits under harmonizing, you know, that's like a pretty broad interpretation of that term. But I think that's a trend that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, it's especially interesting to think about some of Teresa's comments about non-government sources of data, right? And how those data sources produced by different user communities could be tied together and provided as open data. Any other comments on that topic, or we can move on to the next one? Renee, yeah?
I just want to say that I think there is a limit to how much we should ask cities to homogenize. We don't want to create a strip mall version of open data for the world. So we might look, for example, at framework data and then allow the creativity and the diversity to exist in other data sets.
Can you give us an example?
Well, I think that the way that people envision their creative space with parks and open festival spaces, it might be worth it to allow cities or to support cities who say, we have a very different way of thinking about how we organize that data and publish it and analyze it.
Right, and I imagine in a lot of cases that's going to be driven by the type of users that they have either within their own organization, right, and how, you know, tech savvy or how you know, plugged in a particular city government is, or also their community, right? Like I'm sure that the data user community in Montreal or Toronto is quite a bit different than the data user community even in Waterloo, right? Like a mid-sized city. Okay, so next question goes to Steve, or comes from Steve. So this, again, picking up on some of what Jean-Noé was talking about, with regards to data deserts, especially where marginalized populations are concerned, is citizen co-creation / collection of data a natural evolution of the open data movement?
I mean, just to attribute that concept to where I first heard it, it was by a leader in New York City who took on the responsibility of developing New York City's open data playbook. And so he talked about inclusion, and he talked about developing kind of he was looking for a concept that would enable him to kind of get out of kind of Manhattan and get into the boroughs and then understand what was the diversity of users or interested stakeholders or citizens that have issues and types of problems that they're facing on a daily basis, but they don't necessarily talk about data. And so data poverty was a way of being able to kind of recognize that there are biases that are introduced in the way that we collect data. Often we reinforce those biases through different methods and different programs. And so we need to take a step back and then critically assess where that comes from. And what I like about data, the notion of data poverty, is that it forces us to develop a context-driven engagement process to be with users or different stakeholders and really kind of understand, what are the challenges that people are facing? What are the types of issues that they're, addressing on a daily basis? What data is available? What's not available? If there are data collection methods that could be tweaked or, refined to be able to have a better level of granularity or, could produce more or better quality data. And, let's look at that critically instead of kind of just dealing with the status quo of what data is available or not. There's so much data that we don't see, that we don't know. And so this is really kind of a concept that I think works well for kind of data users as well as data producers.
Great. And yeah, so Pamela, and then we've got another question that kind of builds on Steve's original question here as well.
Yeah, I think we really need to tread carefully. I mean, one of the things that I found in my research is that there's a tremendous disconnect between the open data community and communities working hard to redress issues of inequity and exclusion. One exception would be the Toronto Public Library, Bianca Wiley and the City of Toronto to do the Toronto Prosperity Hack last year, where they did a hackathon around the Toronto Prosperity Policy, which is intended to create better quality of life for more people in the City of Toronto. And what was interesting was how much legwork they did before the actual event. It was really important. They dug in and they worked with communities, not for them and not on their behalf. And I'm really worried as a planner that we're going to come down this kind of practice of working for people rather than with them. If open data is going to achieve its true kind of transformative potential, we need to be careful that we build in good public engagement and consultation practices from the outset, and we don't compound the old ones that we've had that are exclusive and paternalistic too.
Yeah, so actually, Pamela, this feeds nicely into Jennifer's comment, which was in response to Steve's original comment. So Jennifer says that, worried that the expectation of citizen co-creation or collection as a response to data deserts may become a form of responsibilization rather than a useful remedy, right? Mm-hmm. So rather than a meaningful way for citizens to interact. Any comments on that?
I think Jennifer's comment's spot on. Like the ethics that we use in other good citizen local government practice need to find their way into this community too.
Yeah. And yeah, in the chat, there's lots of responses here on top of this, right? On the data desert idea. I don't know if we can pull it all in here a little bit, but John Corbett's bringing up some points about if there's any First Nations data sovereignty issues to this as well. Same with Daniel Pare as well and Mookie. I see quite a parallel conversation going on there. I'm not sure how we can work that into the webinar format or not, but I know some of you might have some comments about the First Nations data sovereignty aspect or other digital desert. If there's any other comments that anybody would have, maybe we can do that now and then move on to another themed question.
I mean, on Indigenous data sovereignty, I mean, as an ally, but not as a non-Indigenous person, I mean, what I've seen is that there is, increasingly so an engagement with the Government of Canada to talk about data on a nation-to-nation basis. So, obviously we're not dealing with stakeholders. These are relationships that have their own terms and own context. And I think the open data community has a lot of thinking to do around, post-colonization of data. So, how do we, again, critically look at the data that's been collected by the state, by the Government of Canada, and how do we learn from other cultures? There's a huge tradition around, and assumptions that are anchored in Western, theory. And, I think we need to be able to kind of really look at this from a global perspective and how do we reconcile the open government and open data movement with the reconciliation process in Canada. That's not something that, Open North will be doing, but it's something that, I'm aware that there's a lot of leaders that are doing and speaking about this, First Nations, Inuits, and Indigenous people. And this is actually a trend that we're seeing internationally through transnational networks that are looking at human rights from an open data perspective, which is, I think, a very rich and kind of underexplored area.
Okay. Do we want to maybe keep going on this line a little bit more? I see there's lots going on in the chat. I don't know if any of the attendees wanted to say anything live. I know that's an option that we can do, or we can move on to the next question in order that was asked. Anything? No. Okay. All right. So the next question comes from Majid, talking about what are the main protocols and standards to share data. What are the limitations of sharing these data, such as people's privacy and so on, and then also whether the data which are shared could be misused. So if anybody has any comments about privacy protections, this is in a general sense here, I'm taking it. Any sort of precautions? Yeah, Teresa?
Sorry, I keep clicking on the wrong button to unmute. I should give as a caveat, people have been moving furniture and banging it around outside my office, and there's a street cleaner outside, so by unmuting, I'm introducing all this outside noise into the conversation. I apologize. On the privacy issues, I mean, privacy is interesting in terms of open data, because the typical response with open data is that personal data are not released as open data. So there won't be any personal information released as open data. It's only non-personal data that get released. And of course, anyone who knows anything about big data or even open data knows that it's not anywhere near as simple as that. And it's not as simple as that for a number of different reasons. One of them is, of course, in terms of open data, that data sets personal information can be de-identified in data sets, so that important and useful data sets can still be released even though they are about citizens or about people's activities and so on. So you engage in a process of de-identification. There's always the re-identification risk. And so there's an interesting balance with open data in terms of the privacy transparency balance, or the privacy usefulness balance, the different competing public interests. How much weight do you give privacy in the consideration? If you're going for absolute privacy, you're going to release a whole lot less open data. If you're willing to accept some level of privacy risk, depending on the nature of the data and so on, then you'll be able to de-identify it and release more. So there's that piece of it. And there's no perfect solution to that. There's also the issue of already publicly available personal information. There's a lot of government information that is that contains personal information that's considered to be public, whether it's sunshine lists or lists of donors to electoral campaigns, or lists of people who've applied for building permits and so on. A lot of that information is already public and can be released. But then that raises really interesting privacy implications as well. And then the third piece, and I'll try to be really quick about this and then tie them all up together. The third piece is, of course, that in the big data context, you don't even necessarily need to engage in re-identification in order to have privacy problems, because you can take personally identifiable information and combine it with de-identified information in order to create profiles of individuals that may or may not be accurate, but you're engaging in profiling. So even if you haven't re-identified someone, you've actually associated them with data about their neighborhood or data about other things that you've linked to them in some way, but is not necessarily their personal information. And that creates privacy harms. So I think one of the issues with privacy and open data is that we don't even have that we're using an old paradigm for thinking about privacy when we're releasing open data, in a context in which we already accept, in the big data context, that our privacy paradigms don't work and are hugely problematic. And so we've got this framework for addressing privacy and open data, which actually isn't really very good, and that's shaping how we address those issues. So I think there's some really big issues tied up in there, and I don't think we have the solutions yet.
All right. Any other comments about privacy? Other speakers? This is, thinking of the future of open data, right? We have a world where, potentially, open data actually open? Is our private data open, right? You know, these kind of mixing ideas of what we traditionally think of as being open versus closed, or public versus private. I think this is an exciting world to be working in. All right, yeah, Jean-Noé?
Yeah, maybe just to jump in, I mean, the example of Sidewalk Labs is obviously, you know, a very current one. And, you know, we're in touch with a couple of organizations around the world that are also looking at, you know, what is the litmus test when we talk about public-private partnerships? And I think obviously the, you know, conversation around AI, decision support systems, or anything that, you know, can be called a black box kind of data collection system is actually, you know, raises a lot of privacy issues, you know, in terms of what data is being collected, where does the data reside, what does the private sector partner intend to do with the data, how do they remove personally identifiable information? So we need to kind of really look at these cases and draw kind of meaningful lessons learned and use it as an opportunity to have a public dialogue around those types of issues. I think, you know, there's a tendency within government to be, you know, fairly risk adverse, but we need to kind of understand risk, talk about it, name these issues. What are the perceived risks as opposed to the real risks, and really have a process to be able to unpack that within a range of different types of stakeholders, from academia, from civil society, citizens, and the private sector and the philanthropic sector. So I think, you know, that litmus test in my mind should have a very, very strong privacy, you know, set of issues as part of that. And I think, you know, let's use Sidewalk Labs to be able to establish that. And, you know, that's the kind of work that we're interested in doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. It's such a big splash in the popular media that it brings a lot of these conversations to people who maybe wouldn't normally be having that conversation, right? And potentially to the average citizen, right? Who's thinking about, okay, well, who actually owns the city now, right? Okay, so moving on with some of the other questions here. Next up is Isa, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. So the question here, do you think social media as a subtitle of volunteer geographic information may contribute to open data? Could it take a part of the open data community? So how is the relation, I assuming social media shared on, you know, Twitter or Facebook or other social networks, is that considered to be open data? Can that be considered to be part of it? So again, the future of open data, is it private data that can be accessed through like an API, that type of example? Anybody want to jump into that? I know that all the time I get students asking if Twitter is open data. In one of my classes, we have an assignment where they use the Twitter API to gather tweets and make a map of those geolocated tweets. And I know that that's always something that kind of gets thrown around, this idea that Twitter is this open data source that's out there. And then I have to tell them, well, no, it's not, right? You know, you're contributing that information. It's privately owned. And again, this, you know, building on Teresa's comments, this kind of blurring between the public and the private spheres can become a bit of a problem. I mean, there's no reason why this data can't be used for certain applications and purposes, but it doesn't meet the general criteria of what would be considered open data. Teresa, do you?
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, it's another example of this tiered access to data, right? Because there are APIs for Twitter data that are free and available to anyone who wants to use them. But if you want more data or richer data from Twitter, you have to pay for access. And if you want the richest data, you have to pay an awful lot for access. And so, you know, this is, as I mentioned before, this is one of, in terms of the future of open data, this is one of the things that I think is really interesting, this idea that we might end up going with this idea that some data is going to be free, but then there's going to be premium levels of access, and governments can adopt those models as well if they decide that providing open data has certain costs or burdens associated with it. So I think it's another good example. I agree, it's not open data, but it's also a good example of tiered access to data.
Right. I mean, at least at the, you know, the government perspective, they can turn that into an argument for cost recovery to support continued expansion or improvements to data collection, right? If you have high-paying users who want to use it. But you know, I hear you, it's a slippery slope, right? Moving from providing data as being open to tiered access. Any other comments on that topic theme? Can move on to the next here. Okay, so Mookie has another question here saying, did Geothink capture a municipal open data moment? I think he means like a capital M moment here. that emerged and then is now going down. So maybe because the belief that data is a resource, all these privatization pressures, such as the Google example in Toronto, and as a result, we have less open data. So this trend that maybe, if I'm capturing this correctly, that we had a moment, everyone's providing open data, and now the shine has sort of come off, and we're encountering these more difficult challenges with actually using. Yeah, Marcy, you're muted. Did you have a question?
No, I didn't.
Okay,
someone was coming into the room, so
okay.
1 second.
Sorry, too quick with that. Any other comments, Pamela?
Yeah, I think, Mookie's question is a really interesting one. I'll say that from a research perspective, I'm really grateful that the constellation of the people that we worked with our partners, we were ready to go as this thing started to evolve and change over time. It would have been very difficult to draw many of the conclusions I think that we've shared today if we hadn't been in early on and watching things unfold along the way, which I think it poses interesting questions about technology that's coming now. I think about artificial intelligence, for example. You could argue we could just wait a couple more years to study it, but I think our experience on this grant is that you need to be on the ground early on to be able to track small shifts and big tectonic movements at the same time. So I think we've learned a lot by being partnered deeply with municipal partners, and I'm grateful for their time. But I think the 5-year time frame has been useful, but also the fact that we were in early on and all working together from different vantage points.
Okay, yeah, Teresa.
Yeah, and I like Mookie's question because it's something that actually I think about as well. When I was working on a paper for this project on public transit data and the opening of public transit data, it seemed to me from what I saw that the static transit data was relatively low value, and there was a strong movement around opening the static transit data to create basic apps with timetable information and so on. And by the time that movement got underway and gained speed, you started to get the technology in place for real-time transit data, which has a significant commercial value, much more so than the static data. And it seemed to me, and then of course there was a push to make that open as well, since the other stuff was already open. And I think that that really was a moment where, had the open data movement started up a little bit later, it would never have gotten traction with the real-time transit data because it was too high value. We got some open real-time transit data, I think, because we had already gotten the movement rolling, but the business case changed considerably from the static transit data to the real-time. So I do think that that's a really interesting question and something to be on the lookout for.
Okay, so there are lots of questions in the chat here. I'm gonna pick a couple. Here's one from Daniel Pare, who's a Geothink co-investigator from the University of Ottawa. It's talking about the usefulness of open data and open government. So how do we get the perceived relevance and usefulness of open data and open government to expand beyond the bounds of the traditional open data, open government communities to wider civil society actors and individual citizens as well? So it's sort of like, how do we make this stuff relevant to a larger number of people and agencies, and not just the open data, open government nerds that are around? If I can paraphrase Daniel. Any comments from people in their work or a thing that they might be doing? So we're gonna go with Marcy here.
Because I am actually providing a comment on this one. So I mean, I think Pamela raised this in her discussion, and we've certainly hope to contribute to this, is that providing applications that are useful for or allow a wider audience access to the data. The data is great on its own for certain users, but not all people will understand how to use it, will know how to use it, and really understand its relevancy. And so I think it is around governments creating applications that allow more people to understand the value of the data. But again, I think it's going to be hard. You've got these, you've got showing the public the value of the data, but then that shows also these kind of entrepreneurs, the value of the data, and then you've got this vicious circle of government always, desiring, having a lack of money, and so there's these situations where this this tiered approach to data access may become the new norm. And I think that government has a responsibility to provide access in different ways. And so, you know, I'm hoping that with some of these public-private partnerships, we'll learn from past experiences to see where our access points are more limited, and design these projects so that there can be a wider access point.
Okay, Jean Noé?
Yeah, just a couple of points. I mean, I think, you know, it's less about kind of open data than the types of issues and challenges that we want to put to ourselves. And, you know, if we talk about climate change, if we talk about the SDGs, I mean, those all have open data or open government components in the way that we can kind of implement you know, and execute some of the solutions that have been being developed internationally, and how do we do that in the Canadian context. So, you know, for me, it's like, I like to be able to, you know, talk to a range of different types of people that are interested in solving problems, and then weave the open data piece into that discussion, as opposed to starting from an open data conversation and say, okay, what data sets do you care about? Most people will not, you know, relate to or have a very meaningful conversation if you start that way. So, you know, obviously we have a lot of challenges around capacity building or around data literacy that, you know, that should not be taken in, for granted. But I think, how do we kind of tactically weave the data piece into kind of the issues that people care about, and how do we kind of really develop strong multi-stakeholder kind of alliances and collaboratives to be able to address these types of solutions? I think there's a sense of urgency that we can inject into that, and data can certainly play a role, and should play a role from fact-based decision-making and policy development and all these components. But let's not start with a conversation about open data from an open data perspective. Let's talk about it from an issues perspective, and how do we collaborate together more effectively.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean, I think that that's a sign in the way that the conversation has changed around open data from the early days, right? From talking about data first to talking about the issues around the people first, and then pulling in the data when required, right? I think that's a big change. Okay, I think we're at time now, pretty much. So just a big thanks to all the panelists and all the attendees and participants as well. This has been a lot of fun. So I think, Sonia, you have a couple closing comments?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Peter. And thank you to our group of panelists and the very active and engaged conversations we've been having on chat. Just before I wrap up, I'm just going to remind our attendees that all the slides and the recording will be available on our website at geothink.ca. And as a final reminder, that our next webinar will be on governing artificial intelligence and algorithmic governance, which I'd like everyone to save the date for December 7th at 12 until 1:30, and all the information on that webinar will be available on our website as well. So thanks everyone for a great session, and thanks for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thank you.